This DVD by Bruce Widener is his introduction to the details of the way that he teaches languages. This way that he does it was named Human Language Technology, or HLT, by the U.S. Defense Department and the Air Force as they began employing it. For decades now, this HLT way to work with languages has been able to produce computer software that automatically and instantaneously performs about 85% of the mental functions that its users want it to perform. Then, because of its worldwide use today, it has become a matter of great international importance to try to understand how to advance the performance of human language technology software to that of being complete human language technology, CHLT, software that can automatically do up to 100% of human mental functions. Bruce Widener and his associates have known how to produce that CHLT software for many years now. The question was, who is it that wants and needs this advancement the most? It has seemed very obvious to some of them that the user that wants and needs this advancement the most is the church. So the question became, what is it that can be prepared for the church that most directly shows those seeking this advancement that it is here and prepared for them? There is a great need among the Spanish-speaking 1/3 of the church's membership to have
senior age native English-speaking activation missionaries
learn how to present in Spanish the church materials that this need is for those senior activation missionaries to be able to further convert those converts to the church's standard of church activity. The problem has been, till now, the church has not found a way to successfully teach senior age missionaries to become functional in other languages. However, by seeing the way that CHLT translates those materials from Spanish into English, senior age native English-speaking LDS persons have learned how to master these materials in relatively few hours. The reason that the rest of the world has not been able to do this is well known. However, on this DVD you will see in the background on the wall behind Bruce Widener, as he is speaking, a TCI chart, which is the CHLT way of showing how anything that is said in any language is dealt with by complete human language technology, which makes it easily translatable by a computer and most easily learnable by one wishing to be able to quickly master any language. This DVD introduces you to CHLT. With this understanding, you will see how you instantaneously understand everything that is presented in Spanish in these most important materials, and the way that all of these details in these materials are always clear and understood by those learning them in this way. It is in large measure by the way that these details, as they are shown on that TCI chart in the background, show this to all of those who are so quickly mastering these materials through the CHLT way of learning languages.
What we have here is we have the script for the introduction DVD. Now we're going to have a number of DVDs that show people how computerized language translation works at the 100% level, and the main thing that lets it work at that level is this right here behind us. It's the program for the mentally visualized words. Now that's what the big mystery has been, how to get that done, and we're going to introduce how to do that here. And so what we'll do then is I'm just going to read from the script here for about 33 minutes. And then we'll show how we do 100% machine translation. So here is the script. We say this DVD introduces people to the complete human language technology way to learn another language. And how is that? That is an easy question to answer directly. Basically, the complete human language technology way to learn another language is to learn that new language by understanding everything about that new language as one learns it. Is that a difficult thing to do? No, why not? Very educated people in the Orient have been known in the past to have voiced their view that it was a sad, rather pathetic kind of a thing that people outside of the Orient, in the Occident, that is in Eurasia, Africa, that is some distance from the Far East, are not aware of the benefits in relation to their being able to understand other languages that could be theirs if only they tried somewhat to copy the Orient's 3,000-year-old human language technology way of dealing with written languages. And how is that? Using the example of the European Union, in the year 2009, the some 500 million people who make up the European Union speak 23 different languages. To translate each one of them into the other 22 makes 23 times 22 equals 506 different language directions for translating. For some while now, the European Union has had a $250 billion annual translation budget for doing the huge amount of language translation work that the European Union does among all of those different written languages. On the other hand, the largest country in the world has a population of some 1.3 billion people. They have their 100 mutually unintelligible, different mutually unintelligible spoken languages. Now 100 times 100 equals 10,000 different language directions. However, it can be thought that that largest country in the world, China, for the past 3,000 years that they have been using their human language technology way of dealing with written languages, has had an annual translation budget there of 0 pennies. About 1,500 years ago, the people of Japan, whose spoken languages is about as different from the languages of China as English is, not going to be continue being excluded from the benefits of maximum access to trade with the economy of China by their not using the human language technology writing system of the people of China. So Japan adopted that, and although their spoken languages are so different, the people of Japan have been able to commercially interact with all of the populations of all of the different lands that make up China. It's like they were just one more of those lands for these last 1,500 years. Now, saying that in another way, we could write all of the some 6,628 mutually unintelligible spoken languages of the people of the world with the Nipponese writing system of the people of Japan, and we would all be able to understand one another on general subjects at the level of perhaps a little above the level of 80% of complete understanding. Has the Occident begun doing this? Yes. And what is the result of that? The Internet. Explain. In early 1992, the world's #1 reporter in language matters, the general editor of the #1 journal of the language professions, Language International. Now this is Language International, and this is the picture of the general editor of Language International. And so this is the #1 journal of the language professions, and he is the #1 reporter in language matters throughout the world. So, and this is edited in Britain. Up here it says that on the first page that it's edited in Britain and printed in the Netherlands. And so what he did is he came to Utah to write a series of articles for his magazine. And he called it, this is a picture of BYU, but basically he said he was going to make his pilgrimage to Provo. He said, what is this place where everything is happening? Now the way he began it, he said, several years ago when I first started writing about machine translation, I was struck by the fact that Alps and Widener, of the 4 first major commercial machine translation companies, had their origin in Provo, Utah, a town of which I had not previously heard. To cut a long story short, I then kept coming across Provo in other contexts. I started using WordPerfect software, developed in Provo, etc., etc. What is this place where everything is happening? I asked myself. As the world's #1 reporter in language matters, it seemed to me I must investigate this phenomenon. And then on this next page here, he says, Provo is in the Utah Valley, and it quickly became apparent that, in short, the Utah Valley is for languages what Silicon Valley is for computers. That is, Utah is the language capital of the world. All right. And so, today, the people of the LDS Church speak some 200 different languages. And the Church actively translates from the world language of North American English into and back from about 180 of them. There doesn't seem to be another organization in the world that comes in a close second to that volume of an interaction with the world, with that volume of an interaction with the world language. In interviewing the author of the textbook, and this is the textbook. In interviewing the author of the textbook that began that activity in Utah, that was the beginning of the Internet, this general editor mentions how after this author learned of the BYU attempt, and then he there's these quotes in there. He says, to create a machine translation system, unquote. His first thoughts were that his language learning program from his book, Learn to Read Spanish in 24 Hours, could well work on a computer. In fact, he thought it could lead to new departures in the world of language learning. Now, this is the top guy in the world. He could visualize a new way of teaching the world, how they could learn different languages the way that the Japanese learn to read their characters, unquote. So, with that much of an introduction for us to this, from this general editor, the world's #1 reporter on language matters, let's consider what the activities were that made Utah come to be thought of as the language capital of the world. As we understand that, we can then perhaps best be able to proceed on to understand how it is that each of us, from the time that we first begin studying a new language, are able to implement the complete human language technology procedure to help us to be able to understand everything, that's in full capitals there, about that new language as we proceed, taking each step that there is in this procedure. So, Utah is the language capital of the world. During the 1950s and early 1960s, the U.S. government was promoting the project wherein it was trying to develop a worldwide interlingual telecommunications utility that would be based on a machine translation system, a computer with software that would automatically and instantaneously perform up to 100% of the functions of the mind of a professional human language translators, translating among all of the languages of the world and North American English. Now, because of the goal of the church that is stated in Doctrine and Covenants 90, 10, and 11. And so, this is the goal of the BYU program, and this is the principal, this was the principal theme of the BYU machine translation program of the 1970s. And it says, a second, hold on. Yeah, here is Doctrine and Covenants, section 90. Pardon me. Here's section 90, verses 10 and 11. And then it says, and then cometh the day when the arm of the Lord shall be revealed in power, in convincing the nations, the heathen nations, the house of Joseph, of the gospel of their salvation. For it shall come to pass in that day that every man shall hear the fullness of the gospel in his own tongue and in his own language, through those who are ordained unto this power, by the administration of the Comforter, shed forth upon them for the revelation of Jesus Christ. Okay, so that was the motto of the BYU program. Now, that comes from a scripture in Isaiah 52:10 says, the Lord hath made bare his holy arm in the eyes of all the nations, and all the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of our God. Now, we're going to see what that has to do with language as we proceed on here. However, because of that was the goal of the church was very supportive of that government project. And then, we'll say, at the BYU preschool conference on the evening of September 11th, 1961, President Hugh B. Brown said, and this is what President Hugh B. Brown said, I have it right here, oops. This is the talk that President Hugh B. Brown gave BYU the evening of September 11th, 1961. And then he quoted in here, he said, he read in a magazine recently these things, and then he's talking about, so he said, President Hugh B. Brown said of the prognostication of the principal spokesman for the government project, which was David Sarnoff. Now, this right here, this gentleman David Sarnoff was the chairman of RCA at the time, and he gave this talk. And President Brown said of his prognostication, he said, this is a prophecy. Okay, and so this is what President Brown said here. He said, he makes a prophecy. He says, by the year 1978, the beginnings will have been made in the automatic and instantaneous translation of languages. Remember the message of the Master, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature? Sarnoff says that science will provide the vehicle and make it possible to do just that. Because we can stand in Salt Lake and talk to all of the world, and regardless of their languages, they will understand what we say, and thus will the world become prepared for the coming of the Son of God. Now he says, my brothers and sisters, be prepared, all of this will happen. So this is Brother Brown making that prophecy in 1961. Then we say, in the fall 1966 General Conference, President McKay had a significant part of that conference taken by talks relating to how the church would want to use the services of the worldwide interlingual telecommunications utility as it was developed. And oh, just a second. And this is President McKay's talk, and I've underlined the parts that have some of the parts that have to do with the utility. So we say, then in the fall 1966 General Conference, President McKay had a significant part of that conference taken by talks relating to how the church would want to use the services of the worldwide interlingual telecommunications utility as it was developed. Then it was a great disappointment to the church when 1 month later, in November 1966, the U.S. government made its announcement that it had to abandon its goal to invent the machine translation system that would be the source of the computer software that such a utility would be able to operate on. However, because of the church's commitment to utilize the services that that utility would be able to provide, President McKay assigned the BYU Linguistics Department and the BYU Computer Science Department to continue pursuing the goals for the utility that so much of the government had thought that they had had to give up in regard to. That was the effort quoted above as, quote, the BYU attempt to create a machine translation system. When President Kimball gave his first address as the president of the church in a general conference setting, the title of that address was When the World Will Be Converted. And so here is President Kimball giving that talk. And here it says, when the world will be converted. And then what he says in here, in that talk that he gave on that occasion, he said, President David O. McKay, speaking in the October 1966 conference of the church, said of the scientific discoveries of recent years that will make possible the preaching of the gospel to every kindred tongue and people, they stagger the imagination. So that was President Kimball, his commitment to that. And so then from here on we'll talk about the invention of the internet in Utah. In a book that Bill Gates wrote just after the time that he identified as when the internet really took off. Now the internet began with Novell Corporation in the late 80s and early 90s, but when it was taken elsewhere by world financial institutions, that's when Bill Gates said that it really took off. And he speaks of how it was that because of the way that the word the internet had been used by its government controllers, etc., the name has had a dual meaning that has been a source of confusion ever since. That is that word internet came to mean, this I'm quoting Bill Gates here, both the network itself and the protocols that govern communications across the internet. So that is that the word internet came to be used as the word for both the network itself, the hardware, that is the physical network, and for the software employed to operate it. Why? Well, that hardware, that is the actual network itself, is a fiber optic cable network that in military secrecy was buried by the Defense Department's Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA or ARPA, under the interstate freeways of the USA as those freeways were built. That is why it was known as the ARPANET until the late 1980s when it was renamed the Internet. Now, the Eisenhower administration asked Al Gore's father at the time over the US Senate Highway Committee to pass the Interstate Freeway Act. That passing of that act is what Al Gore is talking about with his identification with the beginning of the Internet, with its hardware, not at all with its software. That beginning was the beginning of the Reagan administration's Star Wars program that did away with the Soviet Union. President Reagan showed Soviet leader Gorbachev that the Missile Directorate of the US Air Force had a large computer at Hill Air Force Base in northern Utah, and it's still there. ARPA had installed computer chips on, quote, every single missile in our missile force, unquote. The LDS Church had established the Eyring Research Institute off campus from BYU to develop for ARPA, from any success from the BYU attempt to create a machine translation system, the intelligent systems technology software that would allow the Missile Directorate to be able to so accurately direct through the fiber optic cables of its ARPANET, and that's where all the long distance phone calls are going now as they ride the light through the under the freeways there, through the fiber optic cables of its ARPANET under all of the freeways of the USA to the computer chips on all US missiles. And they just so accurately direct that to all of the anti-ballistic missiles of the USA so accurately that if any Soviet missiles were ever launched against the USA, the Missile Directorate at Hill Field would be able to knock down almost all of them out over the oceans where their hydrogen bombs would do no damage to the USA. However, Gorbachev was informed that if one Soviet intercontinental ballistic missile should get through that defense so that its hydrogen bomb warhead exploded somewhere in the USA, the people of the USA would be so furious that they would insist that the USA launch all of our intercontinental ballistic missiles back against the Soviet Union, making it so that there would be so little left of what had been Russia. With that, Reagan Star Wars victory, the Soviet Union soon thereafter went out of existence. Then the government began letting the people use its ARPANET for their telecommunications, and the public users changed its name to the Internet. And we have that in a book that Bill Gates wrote that I have here. And so the Eyring Research Institute was, President McKay called this brother here, F. Carlisle Harmon, to found the Eyring Research Institute. And right here he says that two of its spin-offs were WordPerfect and Novell. All right. But the main entity that produced all this was the Widener Communications, and it's when they talk about Widener Communications in here, that's the only place where they mention WordPerfect and Novell. But so, the Eyring Research Institute, where these technologies were developed for these uses, was named for the brother-in-law of President Kimball. And so, here we have, this is a picture of President Kimball, and this is when the second Star Wars movie came out, and the man that made it, he knew that the Reagan administration was going to have win the Cold War with that, and so what he did is he made later, after the Cold War was over, he said that the headquarters of all the worlds was this place called Coruscant. In the middle of the Coruscant was a big temple. The temple was run by a council, and the council was presided over by the president of the LDS Church, okay? And so he made that leader, whose ears stick out a little bit, and he was short and everything. So President Kimball, here he's pretending to be Yoda to his brother-in-law. This is President Eyring's father, Henry Eyring I, who was one of the most famous LDS scientists ever. And he was the Eyring Research Institute was named after him. And Sister Eyring, she's laughing so much that the president of the church is pretending to be Yoda, raising Luke Skywalker's ship up out of the swamp. Okay, but President Kimball, he made sure that nobody learned that what Eyring Research Institute was doing until Reagan told Gorbachev. It was a military secret until that time. So the Ivy Research Institute, where these technologies were developed for these uses, was named for the brother-in-law of President Kimball. He oversaw the development at Eyring Research Institute of the intelligent systems technology that let the Reagan Star Wars program win the Cold War over the Soviet Union. During the 1970s, it was the BYU attempt to create a machine translation system that was dealt with as the efforts that were being made to work toward producing that intelligent systems technology. With that thought, the thought was that after that success, the church would continue on with the efforts to build the utility that seemed to have been the